The air tasted like pennies warmed in a wet fist. Metallic humidity, a film on Elena's tongue. She rolled her gum from one molar to the other and let the slow chew set a beat she could trust. Late morning light should have been sharp. Out here it arrived tired anyway, filtered through canopy and steam. Thunder muttered miles off, polite for now. Her old scar on the inside of her right forearm gave a small, mean tingle, like a wire waking up under skin. Pressure shift. Weather coming. They staged at the training lane's mouth where the mud went from packed to sucking. Boots made that soft suction pop every time someone shifted. Straps creaked. Metal tapped metal. Somebody's sling squealed once. High and annoying, then got yanked quiet. Elena watched hands more than faces. Hands told the truth. Shaky fingers, over-tight grips. That little fidget when someone was trying to look ready. Reed stood forward with his radio up. Procedural calm, like he carried it in a pocket. His eyes swept the squad, not the trees. When he spoke, it was always about lanes and rules, never about instincts. Elena heard the subtext in that. Too, she was here to patch, not to improvise. Support stays support. Rico treated the tree line like a stage curtain, Doc. You bring band-aids or a miracle today, he grinned wide. Loud, on purpose. Like volume could bully the jungle into behaving. Torres snorted and leaned into it. If you pass out from heat, she'll write you a prescription for embarrassment. Then paperwork. Lots of paperwork, she said. Paperwork like it tasted bad, which meant she'd done enough of it to hate it. Elena kept chewing. Quiet wasn't shyness. Quiet was bandwidth. She ran a quick med check with her eyes, sweat already glazing necks. Pupils a little wide from caffeine and nerves. The way a couple of them kept swallowing like their mouths were dry. Training lane. Sure. Bodies didn't care. Heat stroke didn't ask permission. The air smelled like wet earth and pine sap, and under that a faint cordite residue from yesterday's drills, like someone had tried to wash gunpowder out of a shirt and failed. Reed turned his head just enough to be heard, keep it tight. Drink water now, not later. His tone said, Doc stays in her lane. Support. Not the point of the spear. Elena noted it without taking it personal. Reed wasn't insulting her. He was building a system, and systems hated surprises. Elena's gum clicked once between her teeth. Noted. A kid from the rear line did a dramatic stumble and dropped to a knee like he'd been shot by the sun. Somebody laughed. Elena didn't. She was moving before the joke finished. Gloves snapped on. She slid into the mud beside him and checked him fast. All business, airway, breathing, skin, heat. That frantic pulse skittering under her fingers. Talk to me, she said. Low. Not gentle. Not cruel. Functional, I'm fine, he lied. Eyes glassy. Elena watched his mouth. The little tremor at the corner. No. You're cooked, she said. Sit. Shade. Sip. Don't gulp. She shoved a pouch into his hand and held his wrist just long enough to count the pulse. When his breathing slowed, she gave his shoulder a brisk tap, like closing a file. You're not dying on my shift, Rico clapped once. See. Miracle. Told you, Torres smiled, then glanced into the canopy like she'd remembered where they were. The smile faded. Elena's scar tingled again. Faint, but insistent. Thunder rolled closer. Thicker now. Reed's radio hissed, and a weather voice cut through. Clipped. Reading numbers like they were nothing. Eleanor watched Reed's jaw set. Stormline. Moving faster. If it hit hard, Air would be delayed. That wasn't drama. That was math. Reed looked up the lane and spoke like he was handing out gravity. "Stay hydrated or I'll have to carry you." The line got a laugh, because it sounded like a joke, and because everyone wanted it to be one. Rico puffed his chest. "Sir, Doc can't carry me." She'd need a forklift and a therapist. Elena's gum had already lost flavour, turning chalky, but she kept chewing anyway. Metronome. Her scar tingled again, sharper now, and for half a breath, a tag flashed in her head, like a file label slapped onto a folder. Kandahar Pattern. No pictures. No story. Just that sour certainty that the lane's elevation and those 2 clean rises were meant to hurt somebody who trusted them. Wind shifted. The canopy shushed in a way that didn't match the breeze. Somewhere deeper. A pop sounded too crisp for training, then got swallowed like it never existed. Elena didn't call it out. Not yet. Reed gave the signal. They stepped off. Boots sucked free of mud with wet little pops. The jungle closed around them in 10 yards, dim and close and suddenly quiet, in a way training lanes never were. Elena tasted the metal air again and kept chewing, waiting for the first sound that would prove she wasn't imagining it. The first crack came from the left. Everyone's heads snapped that way like they'd been pulled by the same wire. For a stupid half-beat, Elena's brain tried to call it training. Pop, then laughter, then somebody yelling, "Reset!" Then the impact hit and told the truth. Mud jumped at her, right in a violent little fountain. Leaves shivered on the opposite side of the lane. Sound didn't match physics. The canopy took the noise and threw it back wrong. A bad ventriloquist. Humidity spiked all at once, as if the jungle exhaled into her face. Elena's gum stopped mid-chew, then started again. Faster. Her scar lit up, sharp and prickly, as if her skin had learned to recognize danger before her mind did. Rico made a small, surprised noise, more offended than scared. His weapon clattered as he dropped, heavy, awkward, filling the lane. His breath turned wet almost instantly, the first wheeze loud in the close jungle, like a bellows with a tear in it. Thunder rolled nearer, not dramatic, just inevitable, shaking the air contact. Reed's voice cut in, calm and hard. Calm doesn't mean gentle. It means controlled. Elena was already moving. She hit the mud on her knees and grabbed Rico by his kit, dragging him off the centre line toward a root tangle and a fallen log that didn't look like much, but was better than standing there like a target. The ground tried to keep them. Boots and knees sucked and popped. Somebody shifted behind her, and the dry clack of casings hitting mud sounded wrong in all that wet. Too crisp. Too final. Cordite bloomed in the humid air, harsh and chemical, mixing with pine sap where a trunk had been nicked. Sweet and burnt together. Elena snapped gloves on and found the source by feel, not sight. Warm wetness smeared under her palm. Rico's chest fought air and lost small fractions each breath. "Hey!" she said. "Lo, look at me." Her voice stayed flat, clipped. She didn't waste comfort. She spent function. Rico tried to grin and couldn't. The joke came anyway. Shoved up through pain. Well, that's one way to get elevation training. Elena's mouth twitched. A ghost of a smile that didn't earn daylight. "Save your breath," she said. And then, more practical, slow. In, out. Her gum worked faster, like she could chew time into shape. Above them, another crack, then another. The lane filled with people pointing and then changing their minds, because the sound kept lying. Left, said the echo. Right, said the impacts. The wind pushed through canopy and made everything drift, even attention. Elena caught Reed trying to anchor the chaos with words, "Find the origin." Stay tight, his orders were clean. The environment wasn't. The jungle swallowed direction and spit it back warped. Torres tried to make a joke. Reflex, more than choice. This is a really bad. She stopped when a round snapped bark above her head. The humour died in her throat. Reed crouched close enough for Elena to see the tiny scratch he worried at his neck when he was tense. He didn't stare at her hands. He watched her face. Reading for control status, alive, Elena said, sliding 2 words. No poetry. Rico's wheeze sharpened, then thinned. Elena counted breaths without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. Too fast. Too shallow. Shock creeping in, polite and patient. Reed's radio crackled. Half a voice buried under static and distant thunder. Storm. Aircraft. Delay. Then the number slipped through, clean as a knife. 50 minutes, Reed repeated it. Because leaders make bad news communal 50 minutes, Elena kept her face still and felt her gum go chalky. 50 minutes was a lifetime, and a joke in the same breath. Another crack, and this time Elena's ears insisted it came from behind them. Then an impact slapped the log in front of her, showering damp splinters. Sound bounces wrong. Again. Her scar tingled harder, and a tag flashed in her head like someone slamming a folder onto her mental desk. Kandahar Pattern. Organised. Elevated. It vanished before she could open it, leaving only certainty. Rico's eyes found hers, half-lidded now. He forced one more line out, because that's what he did when fear got close. Doc's prescribing lead today, Elena didn't answer. Her left hand stayed firm on his chest, sealing life back into him, one breath at a time. Her right hovered over the rifle, lying in the mud beside his thigh. Heavy. Not hers. Not supposed to be in her hands. Her fingers wrapped the grip anyway. Slow. Inevitable. Like picking up another tool. She didn't fire. Not yet. She just held it and looked up through leaves that shouldn't have been moving the way they were. A shape shifted higher than wind. Deliberate. Not one shooter. Not a lucky shot. Someone was watching the lane from above. Rico's breathing rasped again, thin as paper. Thunder rolled closer. Elena realized this wasn't a single shooter problem. This lane was built for it. For a while, Elena quit trusting her ears. Not because she'd gone calm, because the jungle kept making a liar out of direction, and every time someone flinched, left, bark exploded right. Her gum had gone chalky, the flavour dead, but her jaw kept working. Rico wheezed under her hand, loud and wet, the canopy turning his breath into an alarm. Rain started as pinpricks, just enough to slick the leaves and make the mud hungry. Thunder rolled closer, patient and thick. She kept her left palm firm on his chest, feeling the fight in his ribs, feeling it thin. The rifle sat in her right hand, heavy and wrong. A medic with a rifle. Sure. Cordite sharpened in the humid air and mixed with pine sap where bark had been nicked, sweet and burnt together. Behind her, Reed's voice stayed low, clipped, trying to keep people from becoming targets. Torres breathed fast, then forced it slower. Water ran into Elena's eye and stung. She ignored it. Wiping meant letting go. Letting go meant Rico became a body. That thought kept her hands honest right now. So she looked instead. Not at trees, Not at green. At cuts. Leaves shaved clean along one straight line. Too neat for wind. Bark scuffed in a matching series. All the same height. All facing the same way. Impacts. A lane. Nature didn't draw straight lines like that. Not unless somebody forced it. Her scar tingled on her forearm like an old warning light, the same dull buzz she got before a bleed turned bad. Reed crawled in close, voice still steady, still trying to keep the team from turning into noise weapons tight until ID. The order was sane. The place wasn't. Elena heard the restraint in it, the fear underneath it, and the quiet implication, don't make me lose you to your own trigger. His eyes flicked to the rifle, then to her hands on Rico. No praise. No anger. Assessment. Like he was already building the report he didn't want to write. Rico's eyes found hers, half-lidded. He forced air through pain and pushed out a rasp of humour anyway. Doc's prescribing lead today. The words landed like a dare and a confession. Elena didn't answer. She watched a rain bead jump off a frond when a round slapped bark nearby. Sound lied again. Her eyes didn't. Kandahar Pattern flashed again, quick as a flinch. Organised. Elevated. It vanished before she could name why, but it left a weight in her stomach. Elena shifted her knee, testing the mud. It tried to keep her. She slid anyway, staying low, moving off the straight line she'd drawn in her head. If she could read it, the shooter could read her. She rose just enough to see through a slit in the canopy that didn't look like a slit until you committed to it. Glove on textured grip. The rifle felt like a borrowed tool, not a badge. She exhaled. Her gum stuck to her molars, gritty now, and she squeezed. Recoil shoved into her arms, blunt and fast. A casing clacked into mud, too dry for all that water. The crack echoed wrong, answered from somewhere else. But up high a shape sagged where wind didn't. No celebration, no speech. Elena tracked for the next problem. A glint. Higher. Rain catching metal. She yanked her foot free with a pop, felt roots tug at her boot, and fired again before doubt took the wheel. Another kick. Another clack. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the glint went out, like a light clicking off, and the lane bought them seconds of air to move again. Seconds. That was all. Your hands. Your career. Pick one. Not today. Not yet. The lane inhaled. Not safe. Not quiet. Just less loud for a second. Reed took it like a man grabbing oxygen through a cracked mask. Torres made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had ever found the room in her chest. Rico still fought under Elena's left hand, and that was the only scoreboard she cared about. Relief hit Elena like nausea. Shame followed right behind it. Good. We bought time. Also, I just did something that's going to live in somebody's report later. Her gum kept going. Uneven now, catching on her teeth. Stressed hell, loud on the inside. She repressed the seal, checked Rico's colour, counted his breaths again, hated the way the count wanted to run. She started to shift, because staying still felt like begging. When the reply came, a crack that sounded like it was behind them and above them at the same time. A fraction later bark exploded where Elena's head had been a second earlier. Splinters peppered her cheek and neck. Sap and shredded wood punched her nose. That shot wasn't random. It was an answer, and it meant somebody up there had started hunting her back. Blood hit Elena's eyelashes before she even knew she'd been tagged. One hot drop, then another, and suddenly her world had that bright metallic taste, like pennies on the tongue. The graze across her shoulder came a half beat after the crack, because of course it did. Sound lied. Pain didn't. Heat flared under the strap of her kit, and her sleeve went sticky fast, rainwater mixing with blood and turning it into something colder. Her gum went from metronome to mess. She bit down without meaning to and felt it tear. Grit in her mouth. The scar on her forearm buzzed, then spiked, like a warning that had teeth. Elena tucked tighter behind the big tree in the low rise of dirt, hearing rounds snap bark in places her ears insisted were wrong. She kept her left hand on Rico, still sealing, still counting his breaths like it was a prayer she didn't believe in. The rifle stayed in her right, heavier now that her shoulder burned. She blinked the blood away and told herself one simple thing: stay useful. Pine sap and cordite filled the humid air, sweet-burnt, and her blouse clung to the sting like a joke. Reed crawled in close enough that she could see his jaw working, the way he ground down words before he let them out. He didn't touch her shoulder. Smart. Touch would make it real. His eyes flicked to the smear of red and then to the rifle, like he was trying to hold two incompatible facts in the same frame. Torres was a few feet back, pressed into mud, rain tapping her helmet. She forced a grin that didn't stick. Don't die on dock today, she's in a mood. It was meant to keep lungs working. It landed flat anyway. Elena felt herself almost smile and then didn't. Smiling wasted breath. Another crack, and her ears swore it came from the right. A split second later, dirt kicked up left. The canopy took the noise, bounced it, made everybody swivel and second guess. Elena read bodies instead. Rico's chest still fought. Reed's hands were tight on his weapon. Restraint turned into muscle. Torres's eyes kept darting upward, searching for a line that didn't exist. Elena's shoulder throbbed under the strap, and she knew that throb was going to matter. Wind hissed through the canopy, pushing rain sideways, pushing thought sideways too. Casings clacked into mud, crisp. Her jaw worked, gum shredded. Elena lifted the rifle again and felt her shoulder argue with her. The motion pulled at the graze, lit it up, and her fingers went a little numb at the edges. Not enough to drop it. Enough to remind her she wasn't some clean machine. She found the straight line tells again, bark shaved, leaves cut, and she timed her breath to Rico's wheeze because it kept her from rushing. She fired, and the recoil punched her wound like a fist. The shot felt wrong the instant it left. A hard miss, the sound of it tearing canopy instead of ending a threat. Leaves exploded high, useless. For a heartbeat the lane went even quieter, like the jungle itself listened to the mistake. Then the consequence arrived. The next crack came from somewhere else, a different angle, and everyone's heads jerked in unison. Reed hissed something she couldn't catch, not because he whispered, but because sound kept lying. Elena tasted blood and old gum. Her jaw stalled, then chewed again, frantic. She hated that. She hated needing it. Still, she stayed on Rico and kept him breathing. The fabric stuck to her shoulder. Each shift peeled it and burned. Reed glanced at her. Calculation, worry into liability. The lane turned slippery under pressure. Rain came a little harder now, not a storm yet, but enough to make footing uncertain and make blood look darker. Rico's breath thinned, then thickened, then thinned again, like a hand squeezing a bellows. Elena kept talking to him in short, useless syllables, more for her own timing than his comfort. Reed shifted closer, using the tree as cover, and she felt him watching her the way you watch a fuse. He didn't bark orders. He didn't praise. He just clocked the rifle, the blood, the miss, and filed it somewhere cold. Later. After. If there was an after. Another crack snapped, and this time it sounded like it came from behind their left shoulder. Then an impact bit into dirt on their right. Torres flinched, then froze, trying to decide which instinct to trust. Elena didn't bother with ears anymore. She watched the canopy and saw a ripple that wasn't wind. Her miss had bought them nothing but attention, and the shooter had moved. The lane's rhythm, whatever she'd stolen, was gone. Elena felt it in her gut, in the ruined gum, in the new angle of fear. The lull felt fake, the jungle holding its breath to see what they'd do with it. Rain thickened into a steady hiss on leaves, and the light under canopy went dimmer, greener, meaner. Eleanor's shoulder burned where the greys had kissed her, and the wet fabric stuck like it wanted to fuse. Her gum was shredded into little rubbery grains that kept catching on her molars. She chewed anyway. Habit. Anchor. Lie. Rico wheezed under her hand, loud in the close air, a metronome nobody asked for. She kept him tucked behind roots and that big tree, eyes scanning for straight lines and wrongness. The lane still didn't sound right. Echoes came back delayed, warped like a bad recording. Cordite sat sharp in the humidity, mixed with pine sap that made it smell almost sweet. Almost. Thunder rumbled, closer now, and Elena felt her old scar buzz like it recognized the pressure drop. A body lay near the base of a shot-down perch, half tangled in damp roots and crushed leaves, rain already trying to wash everything clean. Elena's brain did the math without asking. Storms erase stories. Evidence turns into mud. If she wanted answers, she had minutes, not 50. And if she's wrong, this becomes career math too. She slid to the body fast, low, and it wasn't brave. It was clinical. Her gloves were slick. Not just rain, not just mud. Blood too. She didn't look for a face. Faces made things human. Humans made hands hesitate. She went straight for pockets, seams, anything that could carry a reason. The material under her fingers told her more than her eyes. Torn foil and plastic, thin and cheap, folded and refolded until grime had been ground into the crease. Sticky with humidity, carried close to skin. A wrapper, not food, not a bandage. Stimulant. The kind that keeps your hands steady longer than they should be. Elena's scar tingled again, sharper, and she hated how familiar that sensation was. She pinched it between two fingers, held it up just enough to catch the dull light. No logo she recognized, no clean label, just a torn edge and that ugly, oily smear where sweat and dirt had lived together. Her gums stalled, then chewed harder. She could feel Reed behind her, not moving closer, but present. Procedural restraint. Watching. Trying not to step on her work, even if he didn't like that it was her work. Elena didn't overthink it. She kept searching. The map came next, folded tight, damp paper, sticking to itself like a reluctant secret. She eased it out of an inner pocket that had been pressed against ribs, warm once, now cooling in the rain. Sweat-stained fold lines ran through it, dark and greasy from being handled too many times. Marked route, not neat, not briefing room clean. Little slashes and circles, a line that cut through terrain like somebody had already decided where people would move and where they'd die. Elena didn't do a Sherlock scan. She didn't need to. She just let the objects sit in her palm and tell their story the way injuries did. Stimulant wrapper, marked route, elevated perch, the sound bounce, the way the lane had been built like a funnel, the way the shooter answered her like he was offended she'd read the room. Kandahar Pattern flickered again, not as a memory with pictures, more like a taste, dust, heat, a young soldier's blood going cold too fast. She shoved the image down before it could climb out and ruin her hands. Her shoulder pulsed. The rain made everything slippery. She could feel time leaking. She could also feel, in her gut, that this wasn't random. This was someone protecting something. A route, an opium line, a business. And businesses don't send one guy with a rifle and call it a day. They send follow-up. Elena folded the map back, tight, precise, fingers working through pain like they'd done it 100 times. She didn't want Reed seeing it yet. Not because she wanted credit. Because she knew the reflex. Contain. Secure. Report. Lock down the mess before it spreads. Internal discipline. That meant hands on her, questions, delays. Rico didn't have delays, neither did the storm. She tucked the wrapper and the map into her own kit, deep, against the part of her body that still felt like hers. She leaned close to the body one last second, like she was apologizing without the words, then slid back to Rico. Mud grabbed at her knee. She tore free with a wet pop. Her gum chewed, jagged and too loud in her head. Reed's eyes tracked her movement, then flicked to her shoulder, then to her kit. He didn't ask. Not yet. But the question was building in him. Elena opened the wrapper again under the shelter of the roots, rain beading on the slick plastic. Then she cracked the map just enough to see the line, the route that wasn't supposed to exist on a training lane. Her scar tingled like a curse. She felt the storm press down, heavy and impatient. She whispered, so low it was almost for herself, "I've seen this before." And in that same breath, she understood something worse than the ambush. Someone was going to come back and clean this up. Movement turned into work. Not heroic work, just the ugly kind where every step costs. Rain drummed harder now, not full storm yet, but enough to make the leaves slap and the mud slick. The light under canopy got darker, like the jungle was closing a fist. Rico's wheeze cut through it all, wet and persistent, and Elena read it like numbers. Too fast, too thin, hanging on anyway. Her shoulder graze kept reminding her it existed, hot under the strap, the sleeve sticking and peeling every time she shifted. Her gum chewed faster, then stalled, then chewed again. Uneven, stress tell, loud on the inside. Elena kept her voice low and simple. Breathe. Stay with me. Not comfort. Timing. She could feel Reed's presence to her left, procedural gravity trying to pull the team into a shape the jungle didn't allow. They moved into low ground, where brush crowded close and sightlines died. Everything smelled like wet earth, cordite, and that sweet pine sap that didn't belong in a firefight. Wind hissed high in the canopy and pushed the rain sideways, and the sound of it made direction feel like a joke again. Elena kept looking for straight lines, for shaved leaves, for scuffed bark. Her ears could do whatever they wanted. Her eyes were the only honest part of her right now. Reed slid ahead by a half step, not abandoning them, just trying to keep a frame around chaos. His voice stayed radio calm, but it had that hard edge now, the one that shows up when rules start breaking. Weapons tight until I.D. The line landed like a clamp. Necessary, frustrating. Elena didn't argue. Arguing was noise. She just adjusted her position so her body was between Rico and the open lane, because that was her job, and it didn't stop being her job just because her right hand had held a rifle. She felt the map and wrapper pressed deep in her kit like a secret heartbeat. She didn't touch them. Touching them would make her think about them, and thinking about them would steal attention she didn't have. But she could feel their weight, and that weight changed everything. Proof, not opinions. Proof was how you survived the part after survival. Torres stayed close, mud-streaked, eyes flicking up and away, up and away. She was trying to find humor and keep it ready like a flare. Her mouth opened once, then closed. The jungle didn't feel like it wanted jokes anymore. Elena caught Reed watching her. Not in awe, not angry, measuring. He'd seen her counter. He'd seen her miss. He'd seen blood. The medic-only box was cracking, and he didn't like cracks in boxes. Neither did she, honestly. Boxes were predictable. Predictable got you home. This is the part where careers split. Nobody says it out loud. Rico wheezed again, a harsh rasp that made Elena's stomach tighten. She pressed the seal, checked the edge, felt it fight the wet skin. "Stay with me," she murmured. His eyes fluttered, then focused again. "Barely. Enough." They paused in a pocket of brush, where the ground rose a little. Not much, just enough to keep water from pooling at their knees. Rain tapped helmets, leaves, rifles. Elena's shoulder pulsed in time with her heartbeat. She could taste blood in her mouth, Maybe from her own gum-chewing brutality, maybe from the air. Hard to tell. Everything out here blended into the same metallic thread. Reed crouched close, low enough that his voice wouldn't carry far. His eyes flicked once, fast, to her kit. Not a stare. A question with manners. "Doc," he said. And the way he said it was different now. Less nickname, more role. "What are you basing that on?" Cold audit wording. Not cruel, just disciplined. Proof beats rank, and he knew it. He also knew how fast rumors and blame moved once you were back on the other side of the tree line. Elena didn't answer right away. Her gum chewed, then stopped. She watched the brush ahead, watched rain slide off leaves, watched a tiny line of bark scuffed too clean to be accidental. Her scar tingled again, faint, persistent. Kandahar Pattern sat in her head like a locked drawer. She kept it shut. She could feel Reed waiting, procedural patience. She could also feel his restraint tightening around the team like wire. Torres leaned in and kept her voice quiet, focused on Elena like she was taking direction in a clinic, not a kill lane. "Copy, Doc." 2 words, but they mattered. They told Elena she still had some kind of authority here, even if it wasn't official, even if it would cost later. Elena finally breathed out, slow. "I'll show you," she started, and then stopped. Showing meant reaching for the kit, reaching for the proof, making it visible, making it real. And making it real meant Reed's containment reflex would fire. Secure it. Control it. Report it. The right move on paper. The wrong move with Rico's lungs ticking down. A new sound threaded through the rain. Not echo, not crack. Footsteps. Deliberate rhythm in mud. Slow enough to be confident, close enough to make the hair on Elena's arms lift under wet fabric. Not running, not panicking, approaching. Reed's gaze snapped up. Elena's gum started again, fast and ugly. Somebody was coming through the brush, like they owned the lane. The footsteps stayed slow on purpose. That was the part that made Elena's stomach go cold, even with wet heat plastering her blouse to her ribs. Slow meant confident. Slow meant someone coming in to collect, not someone stumbling into a surprise. The rain wasn't a roar yet, but it had teeth now, tapping helmets and leaves, turning the whole jungle into a drum you couldn't read. The wind came in pulses, making the canopy whisper, then snap. Rico's wheeze threaded through it, stubborn and thinning. Elena kept her palm on his chest, feeling the seal fight water and sweat, feeling his ribs try to rise like they were climbing a hill with no top. Her gum chewed, then didn't, then chewed again, ugly and fast, jaw working like it could grind the fear down to something manageable. It wasn't working. Her shoulder burned under the strap, every shift peeling fabric off skin and sticking it back on again. She watched the brush where the sound came from, watched rain slide off leaves, watched a thin, straight line where something had been cut through. Not by weather, not by animals. Intent. Reed lifted a hand, 2 fingers, and the team shrank into the little pocket of bad cover like they were trying to disappear into mud. He didn't bark. He didn't need to. His calm got sharper, the way a voice does when it's trying to be heard without being loud. He leaned toward her, close enough she could see rain caught in his eyelashes. "Doc, on me." Not a pep talk, a command cue, a lid clamping down on panic. Elena shifted her weight and felt her shoulder argue, felt a hot sting and then that numb edge again, like pain was trying different doors. She kept her eyes on the brush anyway. Her ears were useless here. Her ears had been lying all day. She could smell cordite trapped in wet air, pine sap sweetness mixing with iron blood tang, and that weird hot metal smell off a barrel that had worked too long. Somebody out there had been busy. Somebody out there was still busy. The follow-up force moved like shadow with a plan. No yelling, no wild spraying, just bodies sliding through wet green, steps placed, breath controlled. Elena caught a glimpse of a forearm through leaves, a dark sleeve, then nothing. Then another glimpse. Higher. Not wind. They were fanning, not rushing. They expected to find a pile. They expected to take whatever was left. Torres's eyes went wide, then narrowed, trying to track what her ears couldn't. She stayed close, hands steady enough to be brave, mouth tight like she was holding a joke behind her teeth and deciding not to release it. Reed's posture tightened, procedural discipline turning into muscle. Elena felt the wrapper and the folded map buried in her kit, pressed against her ribs. Proof, root, stimulants, a pattern that wasn't random. She didn't touch them. Touching them would make the next part real, and they still had this part to survive. The footsteps changed. Closer now. No longer in the vague distance. Wet suction of boots leaving mud, fabric rasp against bark when someone braced. A bolt's metallic click that sounded too loud in humidity. Elena's scar tingled, and a thought tried to surface, that mental tag slamming down again. Kandahar Pattern. Organized. Close. She didn't let it bloom into words. Words were slow. Words were for later. If there was a later, Rico wheezed, and Elena's hand pressed without thinking, as if pressure could bargain with anatomy. She tasted blood again. Her gum turned gritty, her jaw kept chewing. A shape breached the brush at close distance. Intimate, breath audible, wet and steady, right there in the dark. Elena saw eyes for a half second, saw a mouth set in concentration, saw the angle of a weapon too close to point anywhere but them. No clean shot, no space to pretend this was still a lane with rules. Everything compressed into a stupid, tiny moment. Elena's medic brain screamed about Rico's lungs and her own shoulder and the rain washing away evidence. Her other brain counted the angle and the distance, and the fact that if this man fired again, Torres was going to take it in the throat. Reed would be next. Rico wouldn't even get the dignity of a last wheeze. It would just stop. Her gum slipped. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't fly slow. It just let go. 1 second it was between her molars. The next it slid out with saliva and rain and dropped into mud with a soft, stupid little plop. And her jaw kept chewing anyway. Chewing nothing. That made her hand tremor. Not a lot. Enough. Enough to remind her she wasn't a machine. Enough to make her hate herself for needing a piece of candy to keep her steady. The hostile shifted, breath louder. Elena felt her shoulder pulse and then fade at the edges, numbness trying to take over. She didn't have a clean shot. She didn't have time. She moved anyway. Not elegant. Not cool. Just a hard, dirty choice made with a kind of quiet desperation she would never admit out loud. She fired. The recoil punched straight into the greys like a fist, heat blooming under wet cloth, metallic stink and cordite flashing in her nose. Sound lied. The consequence didn't. The body in front of her dropped. Heavy. Close enough she caught the wet warmth of blood on her glove and the shock of it. The kill didn't feel like competence. It felt like theft. For one sick half-beat, nobody moved. Even the rain seemed to pause. Then reality came back hard. Torres sucked in a breath that sounded like she'd been holding it for a year. Reed's shoulders didn't relax. They tightened. Elena stared at the rifle in her hands like it belonged to somebody else. Her jaw kept chewing empty. Her gum was gone, stuck somewhere in mud, and she felt stripped without it. Her private rule didn't sound noble in her head. It sounded like a debt collector. Reed looked at her, not with awe, not with anger, with something colder, something that was already writing a report in the back of his mind. Later. After. If they lived. Elena swallowed rain and blood and kept her voice low. "Move," she whispered. Her voice shook just a little on the last word. Somewhere deeper in the brush, another set of steps answered, deliberate and patient. They weren't done hunting. The first hint wasn't the rotor. It was the way the jungle went mean quiet again, like it was drawing a breath for something bigger. Rain still tapped leaves. Wind still shoved the canopy. But the insect drone disappeared. wiped clean as if somebody had hit mute. Elena stood in a clearing that didn't feel like a clearing, more like a wound ripped open in green. Her shoulder throbbed under with nylon, and the rifle in her hand still smelled hot, still felt wrong. Then the rotor sound rose, not gentle, not hopeful. It came up from behind the weather like a giant engine breaking through a wall. Air started to vibrate. Leaves whipped and flattened. Mud sprayed in little angry bursts as the downdraft hit. The jungle's lies got crushed under that mechanical roar. For the first time in what felt like hours, sound had a direction you could trust. It wasn't comforting. It was just loud truth. Eleanor's gum was gone. Her jaw kept wanting to chew anyway. That empty chewing made her feel exposed. She tasted cordite fading under wet air, pine sap sweetness still clinging, and that iron thread of blood that wouldn't leave her mouth no matter how many times she swallowed. Her scar tingled, like it didn't believe the rescue either. Rico lay on a poncho, and straps, eyes half open, breath still a wet, stubborn rasp. The rotor wash made his chest flutter under her palm. Elena leaned close and spoke into his ear like it mattered. Stay with me. Still not comfort. Still timing. He blinked once, slow, and she took it as a win because she couldn't afford to take it as anything else. The medevac crew hit the clearing like a practiced shove. Faces behind visors, hands that didn't hesitate, the kind of speed that looks cold until you realize it's mercy. Elena shifted back just enough to let them in, then moved with them, because she couldn't stop being what she was even if her shoulder screamed and her stomach still held that sick, stolen feeling from the close kill. Penetrating trauma, she rattled off, clipped and clinical, breathing compromised, seal in place, shock risk, blood loss moderate. She didn't dress it up. She didn't tell a story. She handed them facts like tools. Her glove was slick, drying tacky at the knuckles, and she hated the way it stuck to the plastic when she passed things over. The medic on the bird nodded once. No praise. No questions. Just take it, move. Rico tried to talk, or maybe he just tried to laugh. It came out as a cough that tasted like pennies in Elena's own mouth. She leaned in anyway, caught his eye. Hey, she said low. You're not done. She didn't know if it was true. She just knew it was necessary. The team stood around the clearing like people who'd walked out of a fire and forgot the world could be normal. Nobody cheered. Nobody slapped backs. Torres stared at Elena like she was measuring where the line was between Doc saved us and Doc is dangerous. Reed didn't stare. Reed catalogued. He always did. He looked at Elena's shoulder. The blood, the rifle, the way her jaw worked on nothing, and he filed it under consequences. Somebody's boot slipped in mud, and the sound was absurdly loud under the rotor. Elena's body flinched anyway. Reflexes don't retire just because help showed up. The bird lifted Rico, and the clearing got smaller around him. Rotor wash tore at Elena's wet hair and made her eyes sting. She watched him rise and felt something inside her tighten. Not relief. Not yet. Relief was for people who believed the worst part was over. Elena didn't. She'd been doing this long enough to know survival just opens the door to the next room, and the next room is usually paperwork with teeth. As the medevac rotated away, the insect drone tried to return, tentative at first, then louder. It felt accusatory. Reed stepped to her side, close enough that his voice could cut through the rotor's fading thunder without travelling far. He didn't touch her shoulder. Still smart. Touch would turn pain into something personal. His expression stayed calm. But it had that procedural hardness now, the one that shows up when the mission becomes evidence. Elena felt the map and the wrapper pressed deep in her kit. Still hidden. Still heavy. Proof-beating rank. Proof-beating stories. Proof-beating whatever version of her Reed needed her to be. She could almost feel his containment reflex itching under his skin. Secure it. Control it. Report it. The right move, technically. The worst move right now, if it pulled focus off keeping the rest of them alive. Torres hovered a step back. mud-streaked, quiet for once. She was listening like she expected Reed to either bless Elena or bury her. Elena didn't blame her. Humans love categories. They hate grey. Reed didn't give her either. He just watched her for one long second, and then he spoke, low and even. "We need to talk about that rifle work, Doc." The line didn't land like a reprimand. It landed like a door closing. Not punishment. Not praise. A warning that the real fight, the one with rules and reports and optics, had started the moment the rotors showed up. Elena swallowed, jaw still chewing at air, and pulled one clean piece of gum from her pocket. She held it out toward Torres first, then Reed, then whoever would take it. A tiny peace offering. A stupid little thing. Nobody smiled. But Torres took it, slow, like accepting it cost something too, and Reed kept looking at Elena like a report he hadn't decided how to write yet. Rain hit the tarp like somebody trying to get in. Not dramatic thunder, just that heavy, patient drumming that makes conversation feel exposed. The field command post was a sagging rectangle of wet nylon and headlamp glare, the whole place smelling like damp ink, sweat, and the sour plastic of ponchos that would never be clean again. Elena stood at the edge of a folding table that wasn't quite level, watching water droplets crawl across the plastic cover in slow little lines. Her shoulder was wrapped and still angry. Every time she shifted, the damp bandage tugged and the sting flared. Not enough to drop her. Enough to keep her honest. Her sleeve clung where blood had dried and then re-wet. Reed was there already. Dry in the way. Only leaders get dry. Not dry. Nobody was dry. But he looked less soaked, less frayed. He had that radio calm face on, and the tiny scratch at his neck was back. A couple heads turned when Elena stepped closer, then turned away fast, like eye contact had become an admission. The jungle was over. This was the next room. Paperwork with teeth. "Start from contact," Reed said, quiet enough that it forced everyone to lean in. No speech, no pep talk, just a request that landed like a command. Elena kept it clinical because anything else would sound like self-defense. Initial fire inconsistent with training. Impacts mismatched to perceived direction. Elevated position probable. Sound bounce compromised our localization. The words came out flat, but her stomach still dropped when she pictured Rico in the mud. She didn't say Kandahar. She didn't say Pattern. She could feel that locked drawer in her head anyway, rattling every time the tarp flexed in the wind. Her fingers were pruned from rain. The glove on her left hand made a soft tack sound when she pulled it off. Torres sat on a case to the side, helmet still on like she didn't trust the room. She watched Elena like she was waiting for a punchline that wouldn't come. Somebody behind Torres had a phone out, screen dimmed, lens angled down but not away. Recording culture. Nobody had to announce it anymore. Elena tracked the phone with the same part of her brain that tracked danger. Not anger, just inventory. Who records, who doesn't, who watches the watcher. Reed's eyes flicked to it too, quick, controlled, then back to Elena's bandage. He didn't comment. He filed it. The filing felt colder than the rain outside. The wrapper and the map came out like confession. Eleanor slid them onto the table without flourish, still damp from her kit. The foil plastic was torn and dirty grime ground into a crease where someone had worried it open with impatient fingers. Humidity made it tacky. It stuck to the table cover for a second before she peeled it free. That tiny peel landed loud in the hush. The folded paper map was worse. Sweat-stained fold lines. Corners soft as bread. Pencil marks darkened by water. A route traced like someone had done it 100 times. The headlamp glare hit the laminated overlay and threw white back into everyone's eyes. Elena saw shoulders tighten and distance form without anyone moving. Nobody spoke. Even Torres stopped shifting. The rain filled the silence and made it thick. Reed reached for nitrile gloves from a little kit box, snapping them on with that rubbery pop that always sounds too loud when people are tense. He didn't touch the items barehanded. Chain of custody, he said, more to the room than to Elena. A reminder that every object now belonged to procedure, and every person in here would be measured against it. Elena's shoulder heat climbed when she leaned in. She swallowed it down and said the thing that came out of her mouth before she could sand it smooth. Great. More patience. A couple of guys exhaled like they'd been holding it. Not a laugh. Not approval. Just relief that she was still human enough to be dry about it. Then the room went back to careful. Standard follow-up, Reed said, and his tone was almost kind, which somehow made it worse. Medical review and behavioral health check, routine after events like this. He didn't look at the wrapper when he said it. He looked at Elena. Routine. That word had been used to justify plenty of cages. Routine means, we can do this to you. Eleanor nodded once. The motion pulled her bandage. She felt the adhesive bite damp skin. She kept her hands flat on the table edge so nobody would see the tiny tremor. Her jaw worked on nothing. Phantom chewing. She hated how exposed it made her feel. Torres's gaze flicked from Elena to Reed and back. Respect mixed with distance. The phone in the back stayed up. Reed's eyes landed on it again, not angry, just heavy. The screen lowered an inch. Not off, just lower. Outside, rain punched harder, and the tarp bowed. Elena watched water run in crooked lines, and understood, plain as pain, the shadow file was opening whether she liked it or not. And the team's silence was already hardening around her. Dawn showed up like it was doing her a favor. A thin grey light sliding under the broken canopy, fog hanging low enough to bead on eyelashes. The jungle looked rinsed and innocent, which was insulting. Elena stood where the leaves had been shredded, and the ground was churned into a brown mess, and the air was cold in a way that made sweat turn clammy on skin. Drip, drip, drip. A steady little metronome, softer than gunfire but harder to ignore. Cordite was mostly gone. The smell was pine sap now, sweet and sharp, mixed with old iron where blood had soaked in and dried and then gotten wet again. That scent didn't leave. It just hid until you stopped moving. Her shoulder bandage had stiffened overnight, and when she rolled it a fraction, it pulled like tape off a sunburn. Somewhere deeper in the trees, water ran off a branch and hit a helmet with a soft thump. Someone muttered in their sleep. Elena didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the scarred lane, because the lane didn't care about feelings. It just sat there, ruined. Her forearm scar tingled, faint, and it made her stomach tighten the same way it had when the first round cracked the air. She worked her jaw slower, gum tucked in one cheek. Not because she was calm. It was just control. A small, dumb rhythm to keep her hands from shaking when nobody was watching. The gum had lost its flavor hours ago. Now it was rubber and grit, and a faint chemical sweetness that made her stomach sour if she thought about it. She kept chewing anyway, because the alternative was letting her breathing go thin and fast. Behind her, the command post was quieter than it had been in the dark. People slept in short, twitchy pieces. Somebody coughed. A zipper rasped. The soft clack of a case being closed sounded too loud in the damp air. Elena didn't turn around. She could feel the weight of the night's words, the way routine had landed like a leash. Medical review. Behavioral health check. Standard. The wrapper and the map were bagged, logged, already on their way to becoming a story she wouldn't get to tell. Evidence doesn't care who found it. Evidence just changes who gets to speak. She flexed her fingers inside damp gloves and felt tackiness at the knuckles, dried blood that hadn't fully washed out. Healer hands. Hands that pressed seals and counted breaths. Hands that also held a hot rifle when the distance got intimate. There was no clean line between those jobs anymore. Elena looked down at her palms, like they belonged to somebody else. Mud in the creases. A nick near the thumb where bark had bitten her when she braced. A faint tremor that came and went. She remembered the close kill without replaying it. It wasn't a movie in her head. It was weight in her chest. The wet suction of boots in mud. the hot metal stink that clung. Out in the fog, a bird called once and then shut up. The jungle's quiet felt held, like it was waiting to see what kind of person walked out of it. Elena didn't feel like anything worth labeling. She felt alive, not healed. Reed's face flashed in her mind, not angry, not proud, measuring, the kind of look that says, I have to write this, and you are part of what I have to write. Elena hated that she understood it. She'd been on the other side of files before. She knew how a sentence could turn into a shadow that followed you. Her scar tingled again, sharper this time, and she had the stupid urge to scratch it like Reed did his neck. She didn't. She kept chewing, slow, and let the urge pass. Fog lifted a little, not in a grand reveal, just in patches, like the world remembering it had edges. The broken leaves overhead shivered when the wind ran through, cold and clean. Elena breathed it in and felt the air bite the inside of her nose. Her shoulder throbbed on the inhale, as if her body didn't want to forget. She pulled her hands out of the gloves and held them up in the pale light. The skin looked normal. That was the joke. Same fingers, same nails, same small scars from 100 little stupid accidents. Nothing on them said what they'd done. Nothing on them said what they'd become. The only proof lived under skin, behind eyes, inside a file folder that was already growing teeth somewhere she couldn't see. A drop of fog slid off her lash and down her cheek, cold enough to feel like a touch. She wiped it with the heel of her hand and left a faint smear of dirt on her face. Elena dropped her hands, tucked the gum to the other side of her mouth, and started walking back toward the sounds of people. Not for comfort, not for closure, just because there was work, and work was how you carried things without spilling them. The world ahead was quieter. It wasn't lighter.